So a while back, I made a video focusing on TF2's most underrated paint, and in that video, I explained why Zephaniah's Greed was what I consider to be the most underrated paint in the game. And by the way, thank you guys for the success on that video, and sorry for inflating the price of Zephaniah's Greed to high hell after that video came out. But the main reason I made that video was not only because I truly felt like Zephaniah's Greed was the most underrated paint, but because it's my favorite paint in the game. Sure, it may actually be underrated by most of the player base, but one of the biggest motivations behind that video was to give my favorite paint a time in the spotlight. So why don't I focus on what are actually the most underrated and forgotten paints in the game? Ones that I don't use and truly know they're underrated. Because I know for a fact that even though the paints I'm talking about today have a dedicated following, the large majority of players may have simply forgotten about them, and some players may not even know they're in the game. That's why today, we're focusing on why and how Drably Olive, the color of a gentleman's business pants, and a man's min are the most forgotten paints in TF2, and maybe how you can better start incorporating them into your loadouts. So let's get into it. An important concept to better explain the reasoning behind the three aforementioned paints being TF2's most forgotten ones is color theory, which I went over with in more detail in my last video. But just to quickly recap, color theory is just the science of how colors interact with each other and how many colors may or may not look good together. Certain colors pair better and others don't. Pretty simple stuff. I was able to give some evidence that Zephaniah's Greed looks good on both red and blue due to its position on the color wheel being on the opposite side of red and closely located next to blue, indicating that this dark shade of green works well with both colors. But with the three paints I'm talking about today, none of them particularly score outstandingly on a color wheel. Starting with Drably Olive, it's nearly smack dab in the middle of red and blue colors, so while it's not the most unfitting color to pair with red and blue cosmetics, other colors in the game can pair with cosmetics better overall, particularly duller accenting shades like Muscleman Brown and Ye Olde Rustic color. Drably Olive, like its namesake, seems too drab of a shade of green for your typical loadout. I'm sure it can work good on certain cosmetics, but I'd say in general, darker shades of green like Zephaniah's Greed I talked about earlier often pair better with both the colors of certain cosmetics and the backgrounds of TF2's maps and the game's textures in general. Additionally, other shades of green like Indubitably Green and even the Bitter Taste of Defeat and Lime exist, which are both infinitely more popular. So while Drably Olive can look nice in many cases, its duller, almost mucusy base color may be less desirable than other more popular shades of green this game provides. As for the color of a gentleman's business pants, that name's too long, I gotta shorten it. As for business pants, it has more of an opposite issue to Drably Olive. While shades of yellow and tans can look nice on TF2's cosmetics, the shade of business pants is personally a little too light and desaturated. I do appreciate more laid-back colors like particularly drab tincture and even aged mustache gray, but business pants is almost too laid-back of a shade of yellow to pair nicely with your favorite cosmetics. Desaturated colors look nice in-game, but to me, yellow just doesn't seem like the best color to do so with, and I think many players could agree. I will say that while I prefer the shade of business pants' yellow compared to something like Australian Gold, I feel like most of the player base prefers Australian Gold since it's more flashy and iconic. I wouldn't say business pants is a bad paint by any means, but it's definitely forgotten compared to brighter colors in the game and certainly has better desaturated paint color alternatives. And now that leaves us with a man's min, which the only point I want to make about it is that it's one of TF2's most bizarre colors in my opinion. Like, it doesn't look bad, but to me, it just doesn't seem to look all that nice on many cosmetics in game. But if you like a man's min, I have absolutely no problem with that, but speaking personally, I just can't 100% get behind this strange light shade of bluish green. Colors like an extraordinary abundance of tinge and even 216,
190,
216 seem to look better in many cases than a man's min, since you can't go wrong with a white or off-white accent color in your loadout. But a man's mint being such a strange shade of this bluish greenish white means that while it is a subtle color, its particular coloration stands out a bit too much compared to other colors seen in game. Even though color theory suggests that these three paints may not be the most fitting paint colors in the game, that doesn't mean these paints can never be used in any loadouts. In fact, while other paint colors may look nicer in comparison, there are ways to incorporate Drably Olive, Gentleman's Pants, and a man's min quite well in your cosmetic sets. This is going to be my personal advice, but the key to using these paints is to not use them as the primary colorations in your loadout, but instead as accent colors. And of course, you're free to paint your cosmetics with whatever paint you'd like, especially these three, but if you want to make these colors work best in your loadouts, I'd stick to the cosmetic types I'm about to talk about. After doing some testing, I've come to the conclusion that a man's mint works best with cosmetics that have darker, desaturated paint regions. For example, older cosmetics like Engineer's Trash Toter and more recent additions like the Sniper's Scruffed and Stitched work nicely with a man's mint, since this paint's brighter and off-colored nature helps counteract the darker tones of these paint regions. Instead of looking like a, well, bright mint color, these cosmetics now have softer, marshy green tones that can better accentuate the cosmetics instead of trying to use flashy or subtle paints instead, only to still have your cosmetics look a bit dull overall. Now, this may not be a surprise to many, but the Business Pants paint works best if you pair it with hair and facial hair cosmetics. If you want a lighter color for your merc's hair, or you happen to have hair similar to this color yourself and want to make your mercenaries look a little more personal, then this paint can suit your loadout quite well. Certain cosmetics like the Heavy's Bullet Buzz, or more iconic ones like the Allfather, look pretty cool with this paint color and can actually fit in pretty naturally with your loadout. Also, you can keep an eye out for cosmetics like the Minnesota Slick or Big Country, since if you want a more natural blonde color for your favorite merc, you can save yourself the extra cash and just use a cosmetic with this color already built into the cosmetic. Lastly, we're finishing where it all started with Drably Olive. Personally, I have no desire to use this paint since I much prefer its green paint alternatives. The only thing I could suggest is sticking to smaller and more subtle paint regions such as the Hunter in Darkness or the Tomb Readers. As much as I hate to admit it, I think this paint is best reserved for smaller accenting regions rather than for larger ones, since I'm not a fan of saying things like just don't use the paint in general. But go ahead and use this paint however you so please. I just think that if you're gonna use this paint, it's best that you do so subtly. These three paint colors, while being some of the more forgotten inclusions in today's vast array of paint options for TF2, do have the potential to be included in players' loadouts. While they are overlooked and outshined in favor of other, admittedly better paint alternatives, Drably Olive, Business Pants, and a Man's Mint do eventually have their times to shine, and when they do, it's up to you to find a nice cosmetic to put them on. But since we're on the topic of TF2's most forgotten paints, I want to know, do you guys have any other paints you'd consider forgotten? Do any of you guys use the paints I talked about in this video? And if so, what cosmetics did you put them on? I'd love to know, so feel free to tell me down in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.